Ellen, for the love of Mike, will you hurry?
Oh, don't holler at me. I'm here. I couldn't find my other shoes.
I have the car out already.
Oh.
You'd better drive. If our connections are real close, I can jump out and run for it.
All right, get in.
All right.
Now, wait a minute. Now, let's see if it starts. Oh.
Oh, for Pete's sake, you almost backed into the hedge.
Well, who's driving this car anyway?
If you can call it driving.
Oh, dear.
Step on the gas, will you, Ellen?
Yeah. Gee, did you see that? Mrs. Ford has her washout already.
Oh, stop looking back there and drive, will you?
Quiet down, quiet down. Why, you'd think we didn't do this practically every morning in the week. Oh, gosh, there's Angelo, the vegetable man. I really should stop long enough to tell him.
Stop. Are you crazy?
You'll be mad if we won't have fresh vegetables tonight.
Oh, never mind. Here's the station. Oh, ye gods, the train's pulling out. I'll be late at the office again.
Well, I could have told you we'd miss the 8:15. It was 8:13 when we left the house.
Maybe if he wants to get his train on time, he'd better set up a new schedule, or better yet, get a new method of travel, something in order of a rocket, perhaps. The rocket idea came to me because I was just talking with our science reporter about them. On this excursion in science, we'll be discussing rockets and rocket weapons, you see. Emerson Markham met and talked with Willy Ley, who is a recognized authority on the subject. Mr. Ley was one of the founders of the German Rocket Society. He is now an American citizen and director of engineering at the Burke Aircraft Corporation in Atlanta, Georgia. What surprised me was that Mr. Markham remarked, just before he came in here, that the use of rockets is really a revival. How come I wasn't able to discover then? Maybe I'll have better luck right now. So, ladies and gentlemen, our science reporter, Emerson Markham.
Thank you, Bob Stone, and how do you do, everyone? Mr. Ley told me some very interesting things about rockets, Bob. He said that before the war, most weapon experts, and of course the rocket experts too, would have needed a lot of persuasion and some pretty weighty facts before they would have been ready to admit a revival of the war rocket in World War II.
There's that word revival again. I know that rockets were used in the past, Emerson, but were they real war rockets? And if they were, why was their use discontinued?
Oh, they were real war rockets, Bob. In fact, the rocket began as a war weapon. The most ancient reliable evidence available points to China as the place of the invention of the war rocket. And the year of the earliest use, as far as can be ascertained, was the year 1232 A.D. Rockets continued to play a role for some time, mostly as incendiaries. And then with the improvement of the artillery, the rocket was forgotten as a weapon of war until, in 1799, the English lost a battle in India. A native prince had a corps of so-called rocket throwers.
And they mowed the British down?
Well, no, the rockets made the horses of the British cavalry shy, and that cost the battle. Then a British colonel, William Congreve, decided to imitate the Indian weapon. Because of the better technique at his disposal, he soon improved on the Indian type and created 32-pound rockets with a range of 3,000 yards, carrying either incendiaries or bombs. Our national anthem, in the line, "The rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air," refers to these bomb-carrying Congreve rockets. Even then, there were mass uses. Copenhagen was burned down by a bombardment with 40,000 Congreve rockets. It happens to be the same figure as the number of modern bombardment rockets which shattered the Nazi defenses on the beaches of southern France when we invaded.
The rockets were fired from special vessels, if I remember correctly, sometimes called bazooka boats.
And so were the war rockets which caused Copenhagen to burn down. Do you see now why I said revival?
I do. But now about the modern war rocket. Seems to be quite an array of various types and sizes. These boats fire a larger rocket than the bazooka does, don't they?
Yes. The barrage rockets fired from the boats or from tripods on land are so-called 4.5-inch rockets. So are the rockets fired from fighter planes against ground targets. But they may be different in construction. The bazooka rocket, Mr. Ley told me, is much smaller, only a little over an inch in diameter.
A little over an inch? That seems pretty small.
The secret of its destructiveness is in its charge, Bob. The fact that this charge is transported to the target by means of a rocket has nothing to do with the destructiveness, but is based on the lightness of the whole weapon.
Well, how about other nations? What sort of rockets do they have, if any?
Well, The Russians have a type which seems to resemble our 4.5-inch bombardment rocket, Mr. Ley said. There is a report that they fired several million of them, lifting the siege of Stalingrad. He says he has no means of checking the figure, but they certainly have used them in quantity. The Germans had an imitation of our bazooka, but larger in size. They had an imitation of the British Z-guns, the anti-aircraft rocket, and they had two heavy types. One is the so-called Nebelwerfer, and that is the six-barreled piece everyone knows from pictures, and the other is the Schweres Wurfgerät, with rockets looking somewhat like enormous war clubs.
Emerson, do those names mean something?
I asked Mr. Ley the same thing. They don't mean much. Nebelwerfer means smoke thrower. It presumably was first developed as a chemical mortar. And Schweres Wurfgerät means heavy throwing engine. It's the German term once used for the siege engines of the Middle Ages. They used that name probably as a screening name, which would not give away the nature of the weapon. The British, incidentally, called their tanks for that reason during the First World War.
I'm interrupting now because I don't want to forget it. With all this, it's even more surprising that most experts, as you said, would have been unwilling to concede a possible revival of the rocket in World War II.
Mr. Ley says that the reason is because nobody can know everything about a field as big as war. The Congreve rocket fell into disuse because artillery began to outshoot it in every respect. Artillery shot heavier projectiles over a much longer range with much greater accuracy. If guns outperformed rockets in 1879, they did so much more in 1914, and even more in 1940. Any question about rockets, Mr. Ley says, was usually answered with the two-word dictum, not accurate. That still holds true. What was forgotten was that there are many situations in every war where accuracy is not so important, but where it is important to drop a barrage as dense as possible. A weapon which can produce dense fire with little accuracy is called an area weapon, and that is what the rocket is. And Mr. Ley believes that is what the rocket will remain.
What about the V weapons of the Germans? Would you call them area weapons, too?
The V-1, the flying bomb, is definitely an area weapon, and it is, by the way, not a rocket, but a model jet plane with a bomb in its nose, something like an aerial equivalent of the naval torpedo. V-2 can hardly be called an area weapon, since it cannot produce a very dense fire simply because of its size. Mr. Ley favors the term terror weapon for the V-2.
Well, now I have several questions at once. One about the V-2 and its size, and about jet propulsion, and we haven't mentioned jet planes yet. And I've heard about a German rocket plane, too.
Well, let's begin with the V-2. It's unique in several respects. It's the only liquid fuel rocket used as a projectile. It's large, weighing about 12 tons at takeoff, with almost 7 tons of liquid oxygen and a little over 3 tons of alcohol for fuel, carrying a 1-ton bomb over 250 miles with a peak altitude of close to 70 miles.
Unusual, to say the least.
Oh, incredible, Bob. Mr. Ley told me he knows the man who probably designed it. He knows the theory the man developed more or less by heart. But until Churchill announced its use, Mr. Ley didn't believe in it. He didn't believe the Nazis had made so much progress in such little time. And he didn't think that they'd spend so much time and effort on something that could only be a terror weapon. Mr. Ley said he thinks the V-1 is much more effective as a war weapon. It isn't so costly to produce and to launch as a V-2. And so far as he could see, the only drawback to the V-1 is that it is interceptable by anti-aircraft fire from the ground and by fighter craft. But then, there is an antidote against every weapon. If one man can think up a weapon, another man can think up a countermeasure.
Emerson, will you please tell us the difference between rockets and jet propulsion?
Well, in both cases, the movement is caused by the reaction of a jet of gases, combustion gases. The combustion gases are produced by burning a suitable fuel. Now, in order to burn a fuel, you have to have oxygen. In a rocket, you take the oxygen along, either chemically mixed in, as in bombardment rockets, or separately, as in V-2. For jet propulsion, you take the oxygen from the air. Now, that's the main difference, the only essential difference.
I want to repeat that. The principle of motion is the same for both rocket and jet propulsion, but jet propulsion has to get the necessary oxygen from the air while a rocket carries it along from the outset.
Right. Each method has its advantages and its drawbacks. Now, in a rocket, you have the advantage that you are independent of the outer air, but you have to carry your oxygen load. In jet propulsion, you don't need to carry that load, but you have to rely on the outer atmosphere. You couldn't go beyond 60,000 feet, for example, and you need machinery of some kind to feed enough air to your engine fast enough, which uses up a considerable percentage of the fuel's energy. We now know that the British fought jet-propelled bombs with jet-propelled planes. Naturally, the planes were faster. They could have better and more expensive engines than the flying bombs, which would make only one trip. And then the Nazis developed the Messerschmitt 163, rocket-propelled, which was again faster. So now we have the P-80, jet-propelled, which is still faster than the ME 163.
So it seems there's a race on between jets and rockets.
Yes. As to which will win, Mr. Ley thinks rockets will, but says it's more an economic than an engineering problem.
Economic problem?
Yes. The rocket motor for liquid fuels is simpler and cheaper than the jet engine, but the oxygen is more expensive. The rocket motor offers the possibility of going to very rarefied layers of the atmosphere, where you could develop really high speeds. The jet engine doesn't offer such speeds because it would not work in such a rarefied atmosphere, but it can burn very cheap fuel. If economic conditions ever become such that ultra-high speeds at ultra-high altitudes are needed, then the rocket motor will be accepted, fuel expense or not. If there is no economic need for such speeds and altitudes, the jet engine will win hands down.
We'll have to wait to see. Meanwhile, we'll have a better understanding of jets and rockets to help us appreciate things as they develop. Our thanks, Emerson, both to you and to Mr. Ley for the facts. Ladies and gentlemen, if you would like to have a copy of a paper by Willy Ley, which tells the story we brought you here, all you have to do to get it is address your request to Excursions in Science, in care of the station to which you are now listening, asking for scientific paper number 201, entitled Rockets and Rocket Weapons. That's scientific paper number 201, Rockets and Rocket Weapons. Your copy will be put in the mail for you free of charge. Now, once again, we've come to that portion of our program regularly devoted to the answering of scientific questions that you listeners have sent in. The answers are as scientifically sound as it's possible for them to be, since they are based on facts provided by staff members of the General Electric Research Laboratory or other equally reliable sources. Well, Emerson, here's the first one. It comes from a lady who would like to know if it's possible to cedarize wood as a means of protecting clothing from injury by moth. She says she has 2 large maple chests in which she plans to store blankets and would like to moth-proof them in some way, preferably by treating the wood.
I took that matter up with Dr. R.D. Glasgow, the New York State entomologist. He says he's inclined to believe that the once popular cedar chests were, shall we say, a bit overrated with regard to protection against moths, which they might afford. It seems that the odor of the cedar wood oil is supposed to be repellent to the adult moth and have some effect in discouraging deposit of eggs on woolens stored in such chests. However, it is unlikely, Dr. Glasgow says, that larvae hatching from eggs which might have been deposited on the woolens before being placed in the chest will be prevented from continuing to feed and from causing damage.
And how about treating those maple chests the lady has?
Well, theoretically, the saturation of any absorbent wood with oil of cedar might provide a measure of protection of the same kind with the same limitations. But as maple is a rather dense wood, Dr. Glasgow wonders whether it can absorb enough of the oil to give even this measure of protection in any lasting degree. It's doubtful if a plan would be feasible and practicable.
Well, how about this one? The lady'd like to know how to remove from fabrics stains which are caused by graphite in a washing machine. She says it's an unsightly black stain. She's very much interested in finding a remedy for removing it without injuring the fabric.
It's a difficult stain to remove, Bob. Our friend might try silicated soda, which is used for preserving eggs. He should be able to obtain this solution from a local drugstore. It's called N-sodium silicate. It should be a strong solution.
How should she apply it?
Well, first of all, the spots should be wet thoroughly with the solution and then rubbed. It's very important to let the solution remain on the material for a short time following the rubbing, but only, say, 5 to 10 minutes. Then the material should be rinsed with water and later laundered with soap and water in the usual manner. It may be necessary to repeat this procedure before she gets results.
Next, this gentleman writes that where he is formerly employed, part of his duties consisted of purifying the water in a swimming pool by using a chlorine bleach. He wonders if an electric magnet could be used for this purpose to remove the iron, iodine, alkali, and other minerals from the water.
Oh, no, Bob. It would be impossible to use a magnet because none of the substances which our friend mentioned would be attracted by a magnet. These materials are right in the solution, so that passing a magnet over the water would be ineffective, as it wouldn't attract anything.
We'll be attracting trouble if we try to go on when our time is up. There's just enough time left for me to say thank you, Emerson Markham, and goodbye, everyone, until our next excursion in science.